The phone rang at exactly 7:50 a.m. on February 20th, 1989. Clayton Johnson, a 35-year-old high school industrial arts teacher, was carrying a basket of laundry down to the basement for his wife when he heard it. He called up to Janice, told her it was their next-door neighbor, Claire Thompson, and handed her the phone. Then he kissed his wife goodbye, grabbed his coat, and headed out the door to his car. It was just another Monday morning in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, a quiet coastal village of about 3,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where teachers like Clayton were respected pillars of the community, where tragic accidents happened, sure, but ending someone's life? That was something you saw on television, not in your own neighborhood. 2 minutes later, just 120 seconds after Clayton walked out that door, a neighbor arrived at the Johnson home to drop off her children for Janice to babysit. She rang the doorbell. No answer. She tried the door and found it unlocked, so she stepped inside and called out Janice's name. The response was silence. Then she heard it, a faint sound coming from the basement. She walked to the basement door, looked down the stairs, and felt her stomach drop. Janice Johnson was lying at the bottom of the stairs, crumpled and broken, blood pooling around her head. She was still breathing, but barely. Her left hand was clenched in a death grip around her car keys. Within hours, Janice would be gone, and within 3 years, her husband would be convicted of ending her life. But here's the thing that makes this case different from every other wrongful conviction story you've ever heard. Clayton Johnson was convicted of a crime that never actually happened. Shelburne, Nova Scotia, isn't the kind of place where you can keep secrets. It's a fishing village on the Atlantic coast, the kind of town where your neighbors know what you had for breakfast and your business is everyone's business. Clayton and Janice Johnson were about as normal as they came in a place like that. Clayton taught industrial arts at the local high school. His students liked him. Parents respected him. He was known around town as a decent, thoughtful family man. The kind of guy who'd help you fix your deck or lend you tools without asking when you'd return them. Janice was a stay-at-home mom who occasionally babysat for neighbors to make extra money. She had 2 daughters, Darla, who was 11, and Dawn, who was 9. Friends described the Johnson marriage as warm and close. They weren't wealthy, but they seemed happy enough. On that Monday morning in February, Janice was scheduled to babysit for the Malloy family, like she did most weekday mornings. It was routine, predictable, safe, which is why what happened next seemed impossible. When paramedics arrived, they found Janice still breathing but unconscious. The injuries to her head were severe. Massive trauma that suggested she'd fallen down the basement stairs with tremendous force. They rushed her to the hospital, but despite desperate attempts to save her, Janice passed away from her injuries just after noon. The medical examiner, Dr. Roland Perry, faced an immediate problem when he arrived at the Johnson home to examine the scene. Well-meaning friends and neighbors had already cleaned up most of the blood before photographs could be taken. They'd scrubbed the basement stairs. They'd wiped down surfaces. They were just trying to help, to spare the family from having to see the evidence of Janice's final moments. But in doing so, they'd destroyed much of the physical evidence. Working with what little remained, Dr. Perry concluded that Janice had suffered a freak accident. The theory was that she'd fallen forward down the stairs and somehow wedged her skull in the narrow gap between the wooden steps and the concrete wall. It was bizarre, tragic, and terrible. But these things happen sometimes. And here's what made the accident theory seem airtight: the timeline. Claire Thompson said she'd been on the phone with Janice until 7:50 a.m. Multiple witnesses placed Clayton at a gas station at exactly 7:50 a.m. He'd stopped there on his way to school. The neighbor who found Janice arrived at the house at 7:52 a.m. Think about that for a second. Clayton left the house. 2 minutes later, Janice was found at the bottom of the stairs. There was literally no window for him to have done anything to her. The police looked at Clayton carefully. They questioned him. They went through his story. But everything checked out. He had an alibi that couldn't be broken. Multiple independent witnesses placing him away from the house at the exact time Janice must have fallen. So the case was closed. Tragic accident, devastated family, community in mourning. That should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. 18 months after Janice's passing, Clayton Johnson made what many people would call the worst decision of his life. He fell in love. The woman's name was Tina Waybrant. She was 22 years old, 30 years younger than the 52-year-old widower. They'd met at church, where Clayton had been seeking comfort and community after losing his wife. What started as friendship had turned into something more. In a big city, nobody would have cared. But in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, population 3,000? Eyebrows didn't just raise, they practically shot off people's faces. The gossip started immediately. Whispers at the grocery store. Conversations that stopped when Clayton walked into a room, looks exchanged across church pews. How could he move on so quickly? Wasn't it suspicious that he'd found someone so young? What kind of man starts dating just a year and a half after his wife loses her life? And then someone, maybe a cop, maybe a civilian, maybe just a busybody with too much time, started asking questions. Uncomfortable questions. The kind of questions that turn grief into guilt. They discovered that Clayton had taken out a $125,000 life insurance policy on Janice just 2 months before her passing. 2 months. In a small town where everyone struggles to pay bills, that was a lot of money. Too much money to be a coincidence. They dug deeper and found that the Johnsons had been having financial troubles. Mounting debts, utility bills in danger of being shut off. The picture-perfect family had been struggling behind closed doors. Suddenly, the lovable teddy bear teacher became something else in people's minds. He became a suspect. A man who'd ended his wife for insurance money so he could run off with a girl young enough to be his daughter. The gossip turned toxic. The whispers became accusations. And the police, under immense pressure from a community that wanted answers, decided to take another look at Janice Johnson's passing. Police reopened the investigation in 1990, more than a year after Janice had gone. They re-interviewed the women who had cleaned up the basement that terrible morning. And this time, something strange happened. One woman's memory had changed, significantly. Now, months after the fact, she recalled seeing blood splattered everywhere, across the walls, on the floor, on the piles of lumber stored in the basement. Far more blood than anyone had mentioned in their original statements. Far more blood than you'd expect from someone who'd simply fallen down the stairs. Human memory is a tricky thing. Study after study has shown that memories become less reliable over time, not more reliable. We fill in gaps. We let suggestions from others influence what we think we remember. We create false memories based on what we've heard or what we think should have happened. But the police didn't question this suddenly enhanced memory. They seized on it as proof that Janice's passing had been violent, that it had been an attack, not an accident. Armed with this new testimony, the mounting insurance policy, and the relationship with Tina, prosecutors built a case. On May 4th, 1993, more than 4 years after Janice had gone, Clayton Johnson was arrested and charged with first-degree ending of life. His daughters watched in horror as their father was led away in handcuffs. The trial was a spectacle in small-town Shelburne. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculated ending, motivated by money and lust. They argued that Clayton had brutally attacked his wife with a weapon, maybe a baseball bat, maybe a 2x4, in a rage. Two pathologists testified that Janice's injuries were consistent with being beaten, not with a simple fall. The blood spatter evidence, according to their changed witness testimony, suggested violence. The insurance policy screamed premeditation. The young girlfriend revealed motive. The timeline that had once cleared Clayton was now reframed. Maybe, prosecutors suggested, Claire Thompson was wrong about the time of her call. Maybe it had been earlier. Maybe Clayton had time to attack Janice before driving to the gas station. Clayton took the stand and protested his innocence. He told the jury he loved his wife. He explained the insurance policy. They'd taken it out together as responsible parents, wanting to protect their children. He tried to explain that his relationship with Tina had developed naturally, months after Janice had gone, as he struggled with grief and loneliness. But the jury wasn't convinced. 11 of them knew Clayton personally. Shelburne was too small for a truly impartial jury. And they'd all heard the gossip. They'd all seen him with that young girl at church. They'd all wondered about the insurance money. On May 4th, 1993, they found him guilty of first-degree ending of life. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Clayton's knees buckled when the verdict was read. His daughters, now teenagers who'd already lost their mother, watched their father disappear into the prison system. In the span of 4 years, Darla and Dawn had lost both parents, one to a tragic accident, one to a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. From his cell in Renus Penitentiary in New Brunswick, Clayton Johnson did what thousands of wrongly convicted people do. He reached out for help. He wrote to the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted, now called Innocence Canada, a Toronto-based organization that investigates potential wrongful convictions. James Lockyer, the director of ADWIC, received Clayton's letter and started reviewing the case file. And almost immediately, he spotted something that seemed impossible to miss. Something that apparently everyone else involved in the investigation and trial had overlooked. The timeline didn't work. It had never worked. Claire Thompson's original statement, the one she gave right after Janice's passing, before memory had time to fade or change, said she was on the phone with Janice until 7:50 a.m. Multiple witnesses placed Clayton at the gas station at exactly 7:50 a.m. The neighbor found Janice at 7:52 a.m. Even if Thompson was off by a few minutes, even if the call had ended at 7:45 or 7:47, Clayton would have had to attack his wife, inflict massive head trauma, stage the scene to look like an accident, and then casually drive to the gas station, all while knowing that 3 different people were expected at the house that morning. No ending would attack their victim when they knew witnesses were about to arrive any second. It made no sense, but there was something else that bothered Lockyer even more. Something that suggested this wasn't just a case of wrong place, wrong time. This was a case where the crime itself had never happened. Lockyer assembled a team of forensic experts to examine the evidence with fresh eyes. He brought in blood spatter specialist Herb McDonnell, one of the most respected forensic scientists in North America. He consulted with multiple pathologists who could look at Janice's injuries objectively, without the pressure of a small-town investigation. What these experts found would change everything. First, McDonnell was immediately skeptical of the witness, who claimed to remember blood splattered everywhere. Human memory, he explained, becomes less reliable over time, not more reliable. The original descriptions from the women who cleaned the basement, given within hours of Janice's passing, were almost certainly accurate. There had been blood, yes. but not the overwhelming arterial spray you'd expect from a violent beating. Then two renowned pathologists, Dr. Linda Norton and Dr. James Ferris, independently reviewed the autopsy photos and reached a stunning conclusion. Janice Johnson had no defensive wounds whatsoever. Think about what that means. If someone attacks you with a baseball bat or a 2x4, your natural instinct is to raise your hands to protect your face and head. You fight back. You try to grab the weapon. In a violent attack severe enough to cause the kind of head trauma Janice had suffered. Victims always have defensive wounds on their hands and arms. Cuts, bruises, broken fingers, evidence of the desperate struggle to survive. Janice had none of these injuries. Her hands and arms were unmarked except for the injuries to her head. But there was something else. Something that had been noted in the original investigation, but never fully explained. Janice was still clutching her car keys when she was found. Her left hand was clenched around them in a death grip. And that detail, that small, seemingly insignificant detail, was the key to unlocking the entire mystery. If Janice had fallen forward down the stairs, as the medical examiner originally theorized, the keys would have been thrown from her hand on impact. But she was still holding them. That meant something else had happened. Herb McDonnell struggled for weeks trying to recreate what could have caused Janice's injuries. He built a replica of the Johnson basement. He studied the dimensions of the stairs, the gap between the steps and the concrete wall, the height of each step. Nothing seemed to fit the pattern of injuries. Until he had an idea from the most unlikely source, a high school production of Peter Pan. McDonnell realized he needed a way to position a person at the top of the stairs and release them in a controlled backward fall. He borrowed the flying harness system from a local theater, the same rigging system used to make Peter Pan fly across the stage. He hired a model who matched Janice's height and weight. He marked the walls of his basement replica with blue chalk at the exact spots where witnesses had originally reported seeing blood and hair. Then he positioned the model at the top of the stairs, secured in the Peter Pan harness, and released her backward. What happened next was breathtaking. Falling backward, the model's head struck the narrow 5.5-inch gap between the third step and the concrete wall at exactly the spots where the blue chalk was marked. The powder transferred to her head in precisely the locations where Janice had sustained her fatal injuries. The impact was severe enough that it would have caused massive trauma to both sides of the skull. Exactly what Janice had suffered. Then, as the model's body weight and momentum continued the fall, her head was pulled free from the gap, flipping her body forward and down onto the basement floor. This created an additional impact injury at the top of her head. Again, exactly matching Janice's injuries. And throughout the entire fall, the model's left hand remained clenched, simulating a grip on car keys. The experiment proved what had seemed impossible. Janice's injuries weren't from a violent attack. They were from a freak accident. Just not the forward fall that had originally been theorized. With this new understanding, Lockyer's team was able to reconstruct what had really happened to Janice Johnson on that February morning. She'd been on the phone with Claire Thompson, chatting about ordinary things. Probably making plans, maybe talking about the children she was going to babysit. She was in the kitchen, looking at the clock, realizing the Malloys would be arriving any moment to drop off their kids. The call ended around 7:50 a.m. Janice hung up the phone, grabbed her car keys from the counter. She'd been planning to run an errand after the babysitting and headed for the basement stairs. Maybe she remembered she needed to grab something from downstairs. Maybe she was going to move the laundry Clayton had brought down. We'll never know exactly what she was doing. What we do know is that at the top of those basement stairs, Janice lost her footing. Maybe she missed a step, maybe she stumbled, but instead of falling forward, she fell backward. Her head struck that narrow gap between the step and wall with tremendous force, wedging between the concrete and wood. The impact caused crushing injuries to both sides of her skull. As her body continued to fall, pulled by gravity and momentum, her head was wrenched free from the gap, flipping her forward. She landed face first on the basement floor, creating the additional injury to the top of her head. Throughout this terrible accident, she never let go of her car keys. She was probably unconscious before she even hit the floor. She never had a chance to put her hands out to break her fall, which is why she had no defensive injuries. It was a freak accident. 1 in a million. The kind of thing that shouldn't happen, but sometimes does when physics and bad luck collide in exactly the wrong way. In 1998, armed with reports from 22 experts in forensic pathology, engineering, biomechanics, physics, and human postural dynamics, James Lockyer presented Clayton's case to the Federal Minister of Justice. The experts all agreed. Janice Johnson's injuries were consistent with an accidental fall, not a violent attack. The minister ordered the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal to reopen the case. On September 25, 1998, after spending 5 years in prison, Clayton Johnson was released on bail pending appeal. The judge acknowledged that the new expert reports presented cogent evidence that Clayton was factually innocent and that there was at least a reasonable possibility that he has been wrongly convicted. But it still took almost 4 more years for the legal system to finally correct its mistake. On February 18, 2002, exactly 13 years after Janice's passing, the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal quashed Clayton's conviction and ordered a new trial. But there would be no new trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence that no ending had occurred, the Crown prosecutor announced they would not proceed with another prosecution. The broad range of expert opinions within the totality of the evidence means that ending of life cannot be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, said Martin Hirschhorn, Director of Public Prosecutions. Therefore, there is no realistic prospect of conviction, and we cannot undertake a retrial. That same day, in a courtroom in Halifax, the Crown asked the court to acquit Clayton Johnson. The judge, Chief Justice Joseph Kennedy, didn't just acquit him. He made sure everyone understood what had happened here. That Mr. Johnson was forced to spend 5 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit was, to state the obvious, regrettable, Justice Kennedy said. His voice edged with something that sounded like anger. The conviction in this matter has been quashed. Let's not be equivocal about it. Clayton Johnson, now 56 years old, broke down in tears as his daughters, now 24 and 22, embraced him. News cameras captured the reunion, showing a family that had been shattered trying to piece itself back together after 13 years of hell. It has been 13 long years, and at last the world knows I didn't end the woman I loved, Clayton's statement read. He couldn't even read it himself. He was crying too hard, so his daughter Darla read it for him. Clayton Johnson's story doesn't end with his exoneration. What happened after his release shows both human resilience and the terrible cost of wrongful conviction. In August 2002, Clayton filed a lawsuit against the Nova Scotia government. In June 2004, he was awarded $2.5 million in compensation for the 5 years stolen from him. His reputation, his career, his time with his daughters. Clayton used the money to start a contracting business, returning to his woodworking roots. The business was successful, and he ran it until retirement. His marriage to Tina didn't survive his imprisonment. She divorced him while he was in prison and remarried, both victims of the same miscarriage of justice. After his release, Clayton reconnected with his daughters. He became a grandfather. He watched baseball. He worked with wood, creating furniture in his workshop. He went to church, where faith had sustained him through the darkest years. By all accounts, Clayton rebuilt a good life. But he never fully escaped the shadow of those 13 years. In Shelburne, everyone knew who he was. Some believed the exoneration, others would always wonder. On September 20, 2017, Clayton Johnson passed away at Roseway Hospital in Shelburne at age 71. His obituary described him as a kind, loving, and compassionate man who had a deep faith in God. He was survived by his daughters Darla and Dawn, and by grandchildren who got to know him only because forensic science and a dedicated lawyer finally proved what he'd been saying all along: he was innocent. The Clayton Johnson case stands as one of the most clear-cut examples of wrongful conviction in Canadian history. Because unlike cases where new evidence exonerates someone decades later, Clayton's case was different. There was no crime. Janice Johnson hadn't been ended. She'd had a terrible, tragic accident. The kind of 1 in a million accident that happens when someone loses their footing at exactly the wrong moment. The 5.5-inch gap between that basement step and the concrete wall was the perfect size to catch a falling person's head and cause catastrophic injuries. But because Clayton made the mistake of moving on with his life too quickly, because he'd taken out an insurance policy at the wrong time, because a small town needed someone to blame for a senseless tragedy, he was convicted of something that never happened. Think about all the pieces that had to fail for this to occur. The medical examiner's initial accident theory was abandoned, not because of new evidence, but because of community pressure. Witnesses' memories improved over time when they should have become less reliable. The airtight timeline that cleared Clayton was simply explained away. Pathologists at trial failed to note the absence of defensive wounds. A jury of 11 people who knew Clayton personally convicted him anyway. And perhaps most damning, nobody. Not the investigators, not the prosecutors, not the original defense attorneys, noticed that Janice was still holding her car keys. That single detail should have made everyone stop and ask, if she was beaten, why would she still be clutching her keys? As the lawyers from the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted wrote in their application for ministerial review, Clayton was convicted due to overzealous police investigation, an overreaching prosecution, misleading expert evidence, and a climate of suspicion in which prejudice and speculation were easily substituted for reason and evidence. The real tragedy isn't just Janice Johnson's accidental death that February morning. It's what happened afterward. It's Darla and Dawn losing their mother through fate and their father through a miscarriage of justice, as the lawyers so perfectly phrased it. It's 5 years stolen from a man who'd already lost his wife. It's a community so convinced of guilt that they ignored every piece of evidence that pointed to innocence. When Justice Kennedy acquitted Clayton in 2002, he made a point of emphasizing that the time unjustly taken from him can never be restored. No amount of money could give Clayton back those 5 years. No apology could undo the damage to his reputation. No exoneration could erase the experience of being imprisoned for ending the woman he loved. But there's something else this case teaches us about how quickly we rush to judgment when tragedy strikes. How easily we let gossip override evidence. How comfortable we are convicting people not on what they did, but on how we feel about them. Clayton's real crime, his only crime, was falling in love too soon. For that, he lost 5 years of his life. And the most haunting part? It almost worked. If James Lockyer hadn't taken his case, if Herb McDonnell hadn't thought to use a Peter Pan harness to recreate the fall, if those 22 experts hadn't been willing to review the evidence and speak the truth, Clayton Johnson would have spent 25 years in prison before even being eligible for parole. He'd probably still be in prison today, serving that sentence. Instead, he got 15 years of freedom. 15 years to rebuild his life, reconnect with his daughters, become a grandfather, run his business, and do all the ordinary things that prison had stolen from him. Not enough time to make up for what was taken, but something. When Clayton Johnson passed away in 2017, he died a free man. His name had been cleared. His innocence had been proven beyond doubt. But nothing, no apology, no compensation, no exoneration, could ever give him back those 5 years he spent behind bars. Or give his daughters back their father during the years they needed him most. Or undo the damage that was done when a community decided a grieving widower must be guilty of ending his wife. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a criminal with a deadly weapon. It's a justice system that's absolutely certain it's right, even when all the evidence says otherwise.